Okay, hi everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us in the room or over the live stream for this new edition of Talks at Google, sponsored by GPOS. And my name is Mario Galarreta. I work in the Wellbeing Learning team. That's part of people development. And we manage programs like Search Inside Yourself, GPOS, Sustaining 10X, Introduction, Fundamentals of Mindfulness, GCALM. And today is my great pleasure as a neuroscientist to welcome to Google and introduce Dr. Amishi Jha. She is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Miami, and she's also the director of Contemplative Neuroscience for the Mindfulness Research and Practice Initiative, also at the University of Miami. And she's a world-class scientist studying the neural basis of attention and studying the effect, the impact of mindfulness and mindfulness trainings in different aspects of cognition, emotion, and also resilience. And actually she's the lead author in one of the very early papers, 2007, 10 years ago, studying the impact of mindfulness training on attention. And over the years, she has focused her work in the impact of mindfulness and mindfulness trainings in different aspects, including education, sports, the military, the business. And right now, her lab is currently doing a number of studies from working with active military soldiers, with accountants, with football players, with firefighters, groups of people exposed to high demands, high performance, high stress work environments. So I think her work is very relevant to our programs and to us at Google. And please helping me welcome warmly to Google Dr. Amishi Jha.
Thank you. Thank you, Mario. All right. Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here. And as you can see from Mario's gracious introduction and the title of my talk, I'd like to share with you today work we've been doing and that the broader field of contemplative neuroscience has been doing around mindfulness. But I think that before I jump right in, it might be helpful to understand the perspective I take in the work that I do, to kind of frame where I'm coming from in the kind of research questions I ask and the orientation I take. So as Mario mentioned, my expertise is in the topic of the human brain's attention system. And the bulk of my research over many years of my lab has been on understanding the brain mechanisms of attention. So we use a variety of cognitive neuroscience techniques to study attention, things like functional MRI, brainwave recordings or event-related potentials, ERPs, as well as behavioral tasks that are sort of like simple video games that allow us to tax attention in specific ways so we can measure the impact. And through doing this, we've learned a lot about how attention works in the brain. And we basically have learned that where we direct our attention biases the processing of the rest of the brain. And in some ways, you can think about this as attention being the brain's boss, right? Wherever attention goes, the rest of the brain will follow, which means it has a powerful responsibility with regard to where we put our attention. And through the course of understanding the basics of attention, we've also come to understand that there are some things that are essentially like kryptonite for our brain's system of attention. And those are listed here. We know that with high stress, poor mood, and threat, our attention system will become compromised and degraded. It won't function the way we want it to, which is particularly problematic because those are the kinds of circumstances in which we want to be absolutely sure that our attention's working well because we'll lean on it. And after understanding this for several years, it became sort of a compelling question for me to figure out what we could do about it, right? So if we know there are circumstances in which attention is compromised, how might we train the brain's attention system to be protected against this? Because it's unlikely for the kinds of professions and personnel that we involve in our research, it's unlikely that we can avoid them ever having. In fact, as human beings, it's unlikely that we can avoid having experiences in our lives of stress, poor mood, and threat. I wish we could, but sorry. So that's where mindfulness training comes into my lab's work. And what I'll share with you is the studies that we've been up to, but also the state of the field of this research. And of course, because science is a team sport, but I'm the only one up here speaking, I wanted to give a shout out to my wonderful team of collaborators and lab members. And one of them's here today, Scott Rogers, who has been a real key collaborator for me, because he's the one that actually helps design and run many of the training protocols. So I'm just very grateful for this group of people that allow me to actually have something to tell you. All right, so let's jump right in. So, see this image here. 100 years ago, if you told people that you might willingly get on a bike that's had its back wheel removed and pedal as hard and fast as you possibly can to get absolutely nowhere, I mean, you'd think that they were preposterous, right? But that's exactly what so many of us do on a regular basis. So my question is really, what's going on here? And I think that the answer to the question on the next slide gives us some insight into this. So answer this question. Does physical exercise improve physical health? For people in the room, raise your hand if you think the answer is yes. Okay, let the record show that's every single person in this room, right? And I'm getting some strange looks like, why are you asking such a ridiculous question? And what I want to suggest to you is the reason we get on exercise bikes or we go for jogs is because we have a cultural understanding that this is true, that we need to exercise our bodies to be physically healthy. It's such a common understanding that we think it's a ridiculous question to ask. But what I want to suggest to you and actually argue is that this understanding didn't come out of thin air. It actually came through a dedicated set of research questions and science that pursued understanding the relationship with regard to physical health and physical exercise. And one of the key really pioneers in this area was actually an Air Force captain who literally wrote the book called Aerobics. He was one of the first people who put maybe 27,000 or so military service members through lots of different tests to come up with what we now consider everyday knowledge, right? This notion of 10,000 steps a day, or the fact that our cardiovascular health depends on our ability to engage in certain kinds of aerobic exercise, comes from his work. And of course, many, many other research studies followed. And the way in which this field of research has parsed the question of physical health and physical exercise is as follows, right? We know that we can look at the physiology, we can actually conduct research that has people exercising and look at their oxygen consumption or whatever it is, carbon dioxide levels in the blood, et cetera. And that gives us an indication of their health, right? So while they're actually performing the act of exercise, we can look at them. We can look at people that choose as a lifestyle to engage in physical activity, elite athletes. And we can see what their physiology looks like at rest to see if it differs from those that don't actually exercise on a regular basis, and that there are differences in the direction of health. We can look at structural changes or gene or protein expression, right? There are so many different ways where we can establish the link between engaging in particular activities and health. And finally, performance. We can look at how people do when they actually engage in activity in terms of how well they perform in a challenge task, for example, running a marathon. So this type of research has actually resulted in, and this is an underestimation probably, around 300,000 articles since 1980 that have been done on this topic. And that volume of research is what I would say is why we have the answer so plainly yes, that of course physical activity is tied to physical health, right? Okay, so I want to make that point. It seems trivial, but that didn't come out of nowhere. And that now, because of this research, we are at a point in our culture, and actually around the world, that our public health officials can give us very precise, evidence-based guidance on what to do. It's not just that it's good for us, but here's what you should do to optimize. All right, so I think I've made that point. And I want to switch gears to a different kind of a question. Does mental exercise improve psychological well-being? How many people would say yes? Raise your hand. All right, fine. It's unanimous in the room, but I was like to think, you didn't wander in here accidentally, right? So I think I was talking to a warmer crowd anyway. But if I actually probed you right now and said exactly what you should do, I bet the diversity of opinion would be quite high. And part of the reason is because we're not at the same level as we are with regard to an evidence base regarding what you should do in order to stay psychologically fit. Right? And what mental exercises you should do. And that's sort of the project of what we're talking about with regard to the science of mindfulness. It's really to systematically and rigorously be able to ask this question to see what role it has to play. Now, it's not only scientists that are interested in understanding the answer to this question. Of course, the National Institutes of Health is very interested in understanding the answer to this question. And what they've done now is surveyed a broad group of our U.S. society, and what they've found is that many people engage willingly on their own, engage in certain mind-body practices to benefit their psychological well-being. And meditation, of which this term mindfulness meditation is a subset, is practiced by about 8% of the U.S. population, according to NIH's numbers. Right? So you might ask, well, what is driving people to do this? What is their number one explanation for what motivates them to practice meditation? Well, it's this. And I mean, I don't really like showing this slide. I think it's kind of stressful. But it does really suggest to us that there's a motivating factor that most of us is the sort of bottom line denominator of what all of us experience in our lives that make us wanting to do something to help ourselves. And when I give this type of presentation and I say stress, especially to military audiences, I usually get immediate pushback. Like, what are you talking about? Stress allows me to rise to the challenge. I'm at my peak because there's something driving me. There's a deadline. There's a challenge before me. I have to be at my excellence, at my best to achieve it. And my answer to that is absolutely. So I want to describe to you a very well kind of explored function that describes what a lot of these service members are saying to me, which is the Yerkes-Dodson law. It may be familiar to some of you. And what it's saying essentially is that there's a lawful relationship between the amount of stress or challenge we experience, the amount of demand we experience, which is shown on the x-axis, and our performance on the y-axis. What it suggests is that, sure, when our stress is low, when we have nothing driving us, our performance isn't that great, back down at the bottom of near the origin. But as our stress increases, we do actually rise to the challenge. Our performance does increase until we reach that sweet spot, what we might call optimal stress. And everything on sort of this side of that sweet spot we'd call eustress or good stress, right? But when we pass that tipping point, that right amount of stress to optimize performance, we're no longer going to benefit from increasing stress. At that point, the curve starts going down, and what we learn is that performance actually declines, and we would no longer call that beneficial stress, we'd call it distress. And this is what unfortunately happens to many of us. Even if something started out as eustress, because it was the right amount of challenge and motivation, if you have to experience that amount of stress for a protracted period of time, it doesn't let up. The chronic effects of that are that they do result in psychological distress. So that's what I'm talking about right now. I'm talking about this notion that there are levels of demand, situational challenges, psychological challenges, even physical challenges that put us at not allowing optimal functioning. And of course, then an obvious question might be, what can we do about it? And as I mentioned, there are populations of people for whom they don't have much of a choice in the level of demand that they may experience. So I like to share this photo montage collage. Actually, it was a part of a project that was done to just capture the faces of soldiers as they're in pre-deployment training, during deployment, and even upon return from deployment. And if you just let your eyes kind of rest on that, you'll see what I'm talking about here, right? And I love this St. Jerome quote to sort of capture what we see. The face is the mirror of the mind. The eyes, without speaking, confess the secrets of the heart. And we see it. We see the costs of protracted periods of high demand in everything about us. So what has been a big motivating factor for me in the research that I've taken on is to see if there's something we can do about it. Is there some way in which we could actually explore this systematically, rigorously, applying the tools of contemplative practice and mindfulness training to be of help? So let me just describe to you kind of the paradigm that I'm thinking about. If the broad question is, how can we best protect individuals over high stress periods of time? And that is to think about some constrained time point. We'll call it time one, because that's the beginning of when we're going to start evaluating the effects. And we've got some multi-week or multi-month period of time that we call the high demand or high stress interval. And at the end of that, we're going to call it, or not even the end, at some period of time, we're going to call that time 2. And time 1 and time 2 are really just the evaluation time points, where we're going to probe something about the participants or the people experiencing the stress to see what the effects are of high demand intervals, right? So what we know is if we don't have a high demand interval, if we're in sort of normative civilian life, you don't have a big project due, you have no special events coming up in your life, there might be little fluctuations around our level of well-being, which is this cartoon graph is sort of describing, but it's pretty much staying stable. That's what this dotted line is saying. We have some normative amount of psychological health. And the prediction is, and if we just talked about this sort of more ordinarily, we'd say, yeah, of course, I feel worse at the end of a high demand interval than I did at the beginning of it. But the prediction is that we can track that well-being will be worse at the end of a high demand period than before. And if this is a knowable trajectory of what will happen to people's state of mind as they enter high stress, and we can know what those high stress periods of time are, let's do something about it. So I want to switch gears now, because as I mentioned, I'm an attention researcher, right? I'm not actually a clinician. Of course, I'm interested in well-being also, my own and those of others, but what I study is attention. So I wanted to talk a little bit about attention and how it relates to what I'm describing as the consequences of high stress. What I'm showing you here is basically 2 metaphors for 2 important brain systems that are, you could call them close cousins of each other. The attention system, I use the metaphor of a flashlight. So attention allows you to direct your mental resources at will to a particular part of space or the internal landscape, for example. And wherever that attention is directed will benefit from preferential processing. If you're in a darkened room and you direct a flashlight, you're going to see what's going on in that location better, right? So as a psychological system, attention does the same thing. Working memory is its sort of, like I said, close cousin system in the sense that whatever is selected, then in working memory is maintained and manipulated for use. So I like to give the example, I use the whiteboard here as, you can think of it as the mental scratch space. Whatever we need to have ready access to, we put up there. But it's a mental scratch space, it's a whiteboard with disappearing ink. It doesn't stay on there forever. So think of the last time, for example, you were having a conversation with somebody, right? And they were talking and you had an idea and you wanted to express it, but you're not going to be rude. You're going to hold that idea in your mind till there's a good break in what they're saying to speak. That's an example of just having taxed your working memory, right? You had to hold that in mind, not forever, but just long enough to be able to deliver it. Or think about, I'm sure this is happening to me more and more than I'd care to admit, but walking into a room on a mission to get something from that room, getting there and having no idea what you were looking for, right? That's a failure of working memory. that scratch space didn't serve you because you're looking at that whiteboard and there's nothing there. You have no idea. The point is both of these systems are critical for literally everything we do. And I'm listing some of the important functions of attention and working memory, this ability to select and maintain information from planning, communicating, learning, even our ability to regulate our own emotions requires intact working memory and attention. And of course, bigger things like the decisions we make, and finally the actions that we produce in the world. All of these require our intact systems functioning. So now let's talk about what we think would happen to attention over high demand periods of time. Same prediction. Whereas normal life where there's not a lot of major stressors happening, the demand levels are pretty up and down, but pretty normative levels of attention. But under high stress, we predict a systematic linear decline in the availability and functioning of attention. Now, as I said, for many of the people that we work with, this is very important, and I would say probably everybody in this room as well, because if we're experiencing a period of high demand, typically that means that we have to be functioning at a high level. And we may actually be experiencing high demand because we are required to function at a high level for a long period of time. And what this is suggesting to us is that the very thing you need to function well and perform well may actually be getting depleted as a result of the high demand that you're experiencing. So at the end of that period of time, you may have to do something big, like give a presentation or have a new product release or go to war in the case of some of our participants. And it's at that moment that you may have less of what you need to do well, okay? And of course, as I mentioned, we work with groups like soldiers or firefighters or high stress, high demand groups. And when we think about service members in particular, it may seem like kind of like not relatable, but just remember that for all of us, there is a sense of what a mental war zone feels like, right? our life may not be life, our consequences may not be life or death in a literal sense, but many times the stresses we face feel like they have life or death consequences. And in some sense, our physiology and our brain don't care what the reality is. We get hijacked in the same way, and the costs, unfortunately, are the same. So I hope that helps relate a lot of this work to our kind of everyday experience for those of us that aren't, preparing for a war zone. All right, so what this brings up is this notion of how we would protect our attention. And I use this phrase, cognitive resilience. I mean, resilience is a broad term that has to do with bouncing back from challenge. Cognitive resilience, I'm going to unpack, and apologies in advance for the very academic sounding description. The ability to maintain or regain cognitive capacities at risk for degradation, depletion, or failure in the face of situational challenges experienced over protracted time periods. Right? So basically, it's sort of this desire to hold steady with our functioning, even though the challenges are increasing. And if we can do this, we have the best chances of performing well under those circumstances that bring it about as high challenge. All right, so the question really is, can we provide some kind of mental training in which we can keep this line steady, even though the people that we're working with are experiencing high demand? And I want to now connect the dots between everything I've said, right? I'm an attention researcher, I'm talking about stress and the costs of stress, and I'm interested in mindfulness. So this image should help you, hopefully, understand where I'm coming from. Everybody know what this is? Right, it's a music player. And essentially, my proposal is that the mind is very much like a music player. It is an exquisite mental time-traveling machine. We can very easily rewind our mind to the past to reflect on events that have happened, right? And we can very easily fast forward the mind to plan for the future. And that ability to go in reverse or fast forward is essentially the ability to control when in time our attention lives. So even if we're obviously in the present moment, if our mind is on the past, we're actually missing what's happening in the present moment because we have been hijacked to the past or the future, right? And this relates to stress. Because most of the time when we're stuck in this mental time travel mode, it's not just a pleasant reflection of events that have gone by or a wonderful visioning of positive outcomes for the future. It's usually not that way for most of us. It's actually stress. And what we know is that a stressed mind is more prone to this type of mental time travel. And most studies now say that the amount of time we spend not in the present moment, but actually in mind wandering is about 30 to 50% of our waking moments. 30 to 50% of our waking moments, we're not actually in the present moment. And when we aren't in the present moment, it's tied to things like ruminating, reliving, or regretting experiences in the past. Anybody ever experienced that? Right? Or when we're in fast forward, we are actually not just productively planning, but sometimes worst case scenario planning, catastrophizing, or worrying about events that not only haven't happened yet, but may never, ever happen. So I hope this helps understand why, as an attention researcher, I care about mind wandering and why I powerfully understand that stress can promote mind wandering and this mental this hijacking of attention. So what I'd like to suggest to you, at least based on our research, is that at least theoretically, we could think about the antidote to a stressed, wandering mind as a mindful one. And this helps highlight the way that I think about what mindfulness is. So mindfulness, I would say, is keeping that button right on play. It is about having this kind of mental mode, this mindset in which we are attending to our present moment experience, right? We're in the here and the now. And to read this definition, again, kind of more formal, a mental mode characterized by attention to present moment experience without conceptual elaboration or emotional reactivity. Or to put it more plainly, it's about being in the here and the now without a story about it. And this ability to be in the here and the now may sound like a great idea. It's like, yeah, I want to be present. It doesn't always come easily for us, which is why training programs that really allow us to exercise the muscle of attention, to put it in this perspective is important for us to really be able to do this. Because unfortunately, as I said a moment ago, when we're stressed, we're less likely to be in the now. We're more likely to be in ruminating about the past or worrying about the future. So it's almost like we have to have this strengthened before we go into a high demand scenario, so we're protected against what the mind will, left its own devices, do. Okay, so I want to unpack a little bit about what I mean by mindfulness by giving you kind of an under the hood, and I'm sure this is familiar to many of you who practice mindfulness, but this is a foundational mindfulness exercise, and I think of it as really circuit training for the brain's attention system. So let me break down the kind of key components of what we do in a mindfulness of breathing exercise. And this is one intended to cultivate focused attention. So what we'd ask our participants to do is for some dedicated period of time, let's say 10 minutes, you're going to sit in a comfortable, upright, alert posture, focus all of your attention to the sensations of breathing. So you're going to constrain where that flashlight is focused now. And you're going to be even more constrained. You're going to select a very specific sensation tied to the breath, whatever's most prominent for that period of time. Could be coolness of air moving in and out of your nostrils or your abdomen moving in and out. Whatever it is, you're going to select it. And then that's essentially the target for your attention for the period of formal practice. Then the instruction is essentially, okay, you've got the focus, now maintain it there. And as any of you that have tried it certainly know, we don't always do what we're told, our mind is told, even if we're telling ourselves. And attention doesn't stay stably on this breath-focused sensation, it will wander. So in anticipation of that, the third part of the instruction is when you notice your mind has wandered, not if you notice your mind has wandered, when, because it will wander. The first key is notice, so keep this kind of watchful perspective to see where is the contents of consciousness. Is it on the breath or is it somewhere else? When you notice your mind has wandered, gently return it back. Right? So nothing big to do about it. Just be aware of where attention is, and when it's not where you'd like it to be, redirect it. So the reason I've highlighted these words select, maintain, notice, and mind wander is because those are the key features from a cognitive training perspective that we hypothesize are being trained by repeated engagement. And what we want to do in the kind of program of research that I've been involved in is to see if our hunch is correct. If we're training these particular systems, we might expect that the strength of our ability to select, maintain, and control our mind wandering may be improved. So that's what we're looking for. All right, and I want to just take a moment to say what mindfulness practice isn't. And again, for those of you who practice, this will sound familiar, but I do think it's important. And as I mentioned, a lot of times I'm briefing audiences who not only don't know about mindfulness, but don't care and are highly skeptical of the fact that this Indian woman's decided to give them a talk on a topic. So it's sort of like protecting myself to say, look, I'm a neuroscientist, and what I'm trying to tell you is very specific with regard to the way I'm talking about mindfulness. And it's not a way to shut down all thoughts. That's not the project of mindfulness. There's no mention of trying to do anything with thoughts other than when the focus is not on the intended object to redirect it back. It's actually not about deep breathing. Yoga is now very popular, and a lot of people conflate what we're trying to do with a yogic breathing exercise, which is very powerful, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about manipulating present moment experience. We're talking about observing what is happening right now. It's actually not a relaxation technique, though many times people engaging in these practices can feel much more kind of calm and relaxed. Because remember, the main instruction is alert, sort of tranquil and alert may be the good pairing. The other thing is that it's not esoteric or mystical in any way. It's not a special state of being. And that these practices really come from the world's wisdom traditions. Almost every major religious or spiritual tradition around the world has some aspect of contemplative practice in it. And what we're doing from the science side is trying to draw upon that world wisdom to see if there's mental training that could be helpful and strengthen the brain and make it more fit. All right, I wanted to mention this because I think this is important. You don't need to do it for hours on end, days on end, years on end for it to be beneficial. And some of the work that we're doing now in collaboration with my colleague Scott Rogers is we're trying to see what's the lower limit. What is sort of the least amount of time in our efficient, high demand, high performance workplace environments that we can do this in a way that is beneficial, doesn't take a second more than is required. All right? All right, so it's no surprise also that mindfulness is getting a lot of popular attention. It's everywhere. It's kind of surprising to me. When I was starting this work, it was actually ill-advised. People thought nobody would ever care at all what I'm talking about with mindfulness training. And you want to study the mindfulness in brain? You're crazy. But it's kind of heartening to me that there is a popular interest. And as you know, one of the reasons for this is organizations like this one that see the benefits for its employees and many other. We have sports figures, military personnel, members of Congress, major corporations that embrace mindfulness as something that could be of value for the people that are part of those organizations. And on matching the popular interest has been the research. So what this is showing you is the number of research publications from 1980 to last year, 2016, with the term mindfulness in the search. And what you can see is obvious is there's a meteoric rise, right? There's this exponential increase in the interest. But if you can't see the numbers very clearly, last year there were 667 studies published that had this term. Impressive, right? Much better than 1980 where there were 0 studies published. But I'm mentioning this to you because even though there's a popular rise, there's a scientific interest, we're nowhere near 300,000 articles. Right? So everything I'm going to share with you now with regard to the state of this research, I want you to really hold take it with a grain of salt. And I'm coming to you as a mindfulness researcher. I'm obviously very committed to this topic. But I think more important to me than you understanding the benefits of mindfulness or the science that suggests that it's beneficial is really coming from a place, my own intention as a scientist to say, I want you to be, as you go out into the world, and consume popular media around mindfulness, I want you to be responsible consumers of the science that you see. And the only way to be responsible consumers of the science is to actually have an understanding of where we're at and where we're not. So that's going to be the flavor of what I want to share with you today. But it is absolutely compelling that we have this growing rise in the science. And I think it's important to understand what that means about what we know now about mindfulness. And as I go around to many different organizations, most recently, last October was at the Pentagon, I got asked this question. Great, you're here to talk about mindfulness. Okay, cut to the chase. Does it work? And it's like, that's a big question, but I actually think it's absolutely a fair question to ask. Any leader wants to make sure that what they have anybody in their organization do is worth the time of these individuals. But even though it's a straightforward and important question, I actually think it's a bit of a complicated question. And I want to break down what I mean by that. So the first is really this term it, right? Does it work? Well, what the heck do we mean by it? It, in our current day and age, is a world of options. Imagine that, world of options. You can think of acquiring mindfulness, familiarity with mindfulness, or learning about mindfulness training through a book, a lecture, an app, a retreat, a workshop. There's so many different things. So when we want to determine if something is effective, if it works, we need to be very specific about what it is that we're evaluating. And that's where, with regard to the science, one key aspect has been to have manualized programs, right? These are programs in which the delivery of the program itself is constrained in a very specific way so that every time it's delivered, there's standards that are upheld and that it's happening in the same order and same sequence, same duration, et cetera. But I think it's important to say up front that to know if something works or not, you need to be very precise about what you're looking at. And one of the two of the most well-studied and well-manualized programs are mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, developed by John Kabat-Zinn at the UMass Medical School, and another program related to that, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which was developed at the University of Toronto. Both of these are about 8 weeks of training, 8 consecutive weeks where the participants meet with the group with a qualified trainer for about 2 to 3 hours a week. And they're assigned daily homework of about 45 minutes, and we know exactly the sequence of the program, and we know what's done, right? And this is a great way in which we as scientists can approach understanding if it's effective, because now we at least know what the container of it is in this, does it work? And now there have been enough studies done investigating this type of training that we can aggregate the results across multiple studies and do what's called formally meta-analyses, right? Where we're putting together and statistically testing how strong the effects are across not just 1 or 2 studies, but dozens of studies. That gives us more weight to the rigor of what we're talking about. But I think that, with regard to the weight of what we're talking about, well, what is it, right? When you ask somebody, does it work? Well, what do you mean by work? What does it actually mean for something to work? And from my point of view, it really is in the spirit of asking this very broad question, does it reduce suffering, right? Does it actually have a beneficial impact on people? And the field of research around mindfulness has actually thought of it similarly. Suffering, though, is instantiated in very specific sort of silos of interest. There are people interested in understanding and exploring ways in which we can reduce suffering in the body. things like chronic pain or hypertension or psoriasis or other stress-related physiologic ailments. Or suffering in the mind with psychological disorders from depression, anxiety, PTSD, ADHD, I mean, the names go on. And the third kind of area of research has been the utility of mindfulness training with regard to suffering when it comes to our relationships with each other. And I think this is where workplace settings have a lot to offer, because this is when we can actually see the impact of certain members of a community learning about and engaging in these practices and how it changes the dynamics that exist. So some of the studies in this area, which I would say is really a newer area, is looking at things like marital relationships, parent-child relationships, and of course, starting to be done has been workplace settings. So, in asking about whether something works, we can go more deeply into the particular areas. And I'm listing some of these, but of course, we could go on and on about all the different topics that have been investigated. Now we're at the point with regard to these meta-analysis where we can say, okay, across a variety of programs that have been manualized and are investigated in a rigorous way, what's the impact on certain kinds of measures? In this case, looking at psychological and physical measures. So this was a study that was a few years back now, really in the premier journal of the medical establishment in this country, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And they had 47 studies that they looked at, 3,500 participants. And I want to make a point here to say, they did not conclude that mindfulness is some kind of magic answer to all of life's woes. Their conclusions were actually that the effects are moderate, right? 10 to 20%. This gives me a sense that this is a realistic and solidly done study, because probably it is the case with the current state of research with such a few numbers that would make sense. But I do want to point out what they said that translates into, because that I think is quite compelling. They said even though it's moderate evidence with 10 to 20% for these things like depression and pain, the effects are comparable with what would be expected from the use of an antidepressant in a primary care population, but without associated toxicities. And that, to me, has the potential to be some kind of a game changer. If we can engage in regular mental exercise to have the effects comparable to psychopharmacologic solutions that are widely used, that's pretty powerful stuff. So I see this as a very kind of promising beginning of an endeavor. And more studies have gone on to do this, where 2 years ago there was 115 randomized controlled trials, and again finding similar benefits with psychological illness and physical functioning. I want to make the point about randomized controlled trials, because that's sort of the methodology of science, right? That's the gold standard of how we conduct our research. We have people in a randomized trial that are enrolled into a study without knowing what condition, what training program they're going to be enrolled in, and then they're randomly assigned to either get, let's say, mindfulness-based stress reduction, or nothing, or some other program that's matched along those dimensions. And because they're randomly assigned, and because these programs have been matched, now if you find that one group outperforms another, you have more confidence that it's because of the training that they did. So that's also very important, is that when we look at studies and their effectiveness, are they holding the highest standard of science as they look at results? So does it work? Yes. Right now, as I said before, I'd love to be able to consider that this is where we're at and happily go away now and you're done for the afternoon. But unfortunately, that's not quite it. And one of the things that's coming up is, though the evidence is is amassing at a very fast pace, which is great, there's actually been a lot of upheaval in our field as researchers in mindfulness. One of the things that's come up with regard to all of these positive benefits is that the field itself may be biased in its reporting, right? I love this one. The power of positive thinking skews mindfulness studies. I mean, I think it's cute, but it's also important to realize what the costs of doing this might be. And what is this actually meaning? What does this mean that there's a positive bias? What it's saying is that out of all the studies that are done, out of all the research studies that have been funded from federal agencies like the NIH on mindfulness training, far fewer are reporting than should. That's the first point. There are fewer studies that are actually being published based on these funded projects, and those that are reporting are disproportionately positive. So this raises a lot of red flags, because it suggests that there may be a lot of studies that are finding nothing, or finding opposite or unexpected effects, and people are essentially leaving them in their file drawers. right? And this to me is like sort of a call to action for other scientists as well, is, publish those null results, publish studies in which you find nothing or even unexpectedly different things. And why do I think this is important? Well, part of it is because that's the only way we're gonna understand what best practices are. If you do a mindfulness training study where your intervention is 5 minutes over 3 days, and you find that 5 minutes of mindfulness practice over 3 days has no benefits, and you never publish that, we'll never know that that low of a dose has no effect. And it's important so that we know at what level we start seeing benefits. Again, look at the physical fitness analogy. The number is not 3 steps a day, it's 10,000 steps a day. So where did that come from? It came from knowing how low you can go to still have tractable benefits. So that's my sort of plea to other scientists, is that you have to be more rigorous, publish null results. A lot of efforts now in the science are to pre-register trials, so that the moment you get the funding, you actually write the paper that says, this is all what I'm gonna do. And no matter what you find, your study will be published. So that if you find nothing, it's still gonna get published. And that helps put the load off of the researcher who, that's their main fear. It's like, if I find nothing, nobody's gonna publish this. And I think that this is a great direction that science is going. But from the point of view of our conversation, I just wanted to say, I'd love to say the answer is yes. But I won't say the answer is yes, because it's actually not yes. It's a highly provisional yes. And if I could, I'd make the font even smaller for the word yes. Because I think so much more research is needed. We're nowhere near the numbers regarding physical fitness, and that's the only way this is going to be a sustainable enterprise that's beneficial for all of us. All right? So, but I wanted to basically say this. Does it work is important, but as a neuroscientist, my interest was not in that alone. It was how. Right? How is it that the randomized control trials that have been done suggest that mindfulness training is beneficial for something like psoriasis, having a better marriage, and curing some kind of psychological illness? How is that even possible? What is happening under the hood, which is what drives us and interests us in looking at the brain? So let's talk a little bit about the brain and what we know about the brain with regard to mindfulness. And I wanted to just bring up this term that is actually a pretty new term. When I was in graduate school, this notion of neuroplasticity was not well understood at all. And a similar term, actually a related term called neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons in the brain, was not even probably coined when I started my undergrad, right? So what is neurogenesis? What does that even mean? Well, when I was in graduate school, the notion was that we were born with a certain number of neurons, they developed into early adulthood, and then whatever we were left with at that point is the number of neurons we had until the slow decline and their death through the course of our lives. Not a very hopeful scenario, right? It's like you have something and then it'll just decline. While I was in graduate school, actually toward the end of my time in the mid-90s, this term neurogenesis in the adult brain came about, which was pretty exciting. That means that adults can grow new neurons, and neuroplasticity, the brain can actually reorganize itself in a way that could actually promote its better health. We knew a lot about neuroplasticity from the stroke recovery side. We know that people can get better if they've been injured. But this is suggesting even in a healthy brain, you can get healthier through the kinds of mental exercises you engage in. And why am I showing this crumpled up piece of paper? It's really just to kind of demystify the brain. The brain is essentially, think of a sheet of tissue, kind of sheets of tissue layered one on top of each other, right? So you got a stack of tissue now, crumpled up as tightly as you possibly can, and then put inside this handy container called the skull, and that's our brain. And this crumpling up, this tightly packed nature of those cell layers allows for the efficient communication between cells. Now, it ends up that as we age, as we have stress, that crumpling diminishes. The brains get smoother as we age, and that suggests a lack of efficiency in our brain function. So why am I mentioning this? Because this is the kind of thing people are looking at with regard to brain changes that may be beneficial with mindfulness training. And I want to just mention that, again, when we look at the brain, we're going to look at it with a very specific eye to the kind of cognitive training we think that we're engaging in. So this is, again, reminding you of what that basic mindfulness practice is, right? Select, maintain, notice, control your mind wandering. And through the field of sort of basic cognitive neuroscience, nothing to do with the field of contemplative neuroscience or mindfulness, just basic cognitive neuroscience, we know a lot about how the brain is activated as a function of intentionally selecting and maintaining, noticing, and mind wandering. And that's shown in this slide. This is a study done by actually a researcher at Stanford a few years back. And what it's showing you is that these are identifiable brain networks that exist in all of us and that get activated as a function of what particular process, functional process we're engaged in. So a couple of key things. The particular regions don't actually matter. That, to me, it doesn't matter so much that you know those. But what it is important to me that you know is that these different networks are basically, for the most part, non-overlapping, meaning that they're taxing and activating different parts of the brain, and that they're mutually inhibitory. What do I mean by that? Well, what that means is if a brain network that is involved in selecting and maintaining is activated, another network, let's say having to do with mind wandering, is going to be deactivated. And vice versa. If you are mind wandering, the chances of you being able to fully activate the select and maintain network are reduced because of this anti-correlation issue. Now, I think that this is important because not only does it tell us about the nature of how these processes work in relationship to each other, but they also give us great hypotheses of where we think mindfulness training may have its structural and functional effects, because these are the processes that we know from the training program are key to what's being exercised. Does that make sense? Okay, so what I wanted to just tell you, again, sort of the state of the field right now, is that there have been many functional studies. There was a recent meta-analysis of 78 studies. What I'm showing you here is a meta-analysis of structural studies. So this is just looking at the brains of people across multiple studies. And the point I want to make, again, the particular regions aren't key, but what's key is that it's not random. And that some of those same nodes with regard to selecting, maintaining, and controlling mind wandering are the ones that we are seeing structural changes within. Suggesting, and the nature of those structural changes, by the way, is this improved gyrification. So it's like the decrumpling may be happening, right, as we kind of age or as we experience stress, but with practices like daily mindfulness exercises, there are certain nodes that remain intact, that don't show that degradation. And what's important here, though, I think this is very interesting, right, that we see tractable structural changes. But there is something I want to, again, mention to you as being honest brokers of the science. These are not randomized controlled trials. These are studies done in people that have chosen on their own to practice mindfulness training for let's say 5 to 20 years. So when we see changes like this, it could be because of the mindfulness, but it could be that people that decide to practice mindfulness have other dietary choices, different social networks, different professional choices that they make. Or they may just be different to begin with. Their brains may, even before they ever started doing anything having to do with meditation, may have been different. So what we don't know from studies like this is what's driving the nature of the change, which means that to actually be rigorous in what we do, we'd have to assign people to different types of practices and compare the structure and function of their brain after they engage in those practices for a period of time. But that's where the science is headed. That's what we want to do next, or we are doing, I should say. Okay, so just to kind of catch us up to speed, you remember this figure and the number of studies. I want to just tell you that we're now at a very similar point with regard to the scientific strategies we're taking to examine mindfulness. That we now know what the brain looks like when people are actively engaging in practice, or what it looks like at rest, or the structural changes. The growing area of research from my point of view that is still in need of more bolstering is looking at the impact, because I actually frankly think this is the bottom line. It's great that your brain changes, but if it has no impact on your performance, it's not worth a lot in our day-to-day lives. So one of the key questions I've been interested in is how does engaging in a formal mindfulness program, for example, alter performance? And our predictions there are straightforward as well. Right? We would expect, and in fact, this is showing you a subset of studies that are showing that people that engage in a multi-week mindfulness training program compared to those who don't or do some other kind of program improve in their performance on selective attention tasks, working memory tasks, and they reduce the amount of mind wandering that they're reporting. And I think this is very exciting because it suggests that you can functionally improve people in their performance as a function of this training. And I just wanted to now end by saying that, in the work that we're doing, as I said at the outset, our interest isn't so much We want people to get better, of course, but we want to see if we can use mindfulness training in a strategic way to build resilience in groups that are really vulnerable to having degradation in these processes. And one of the programs that we've developed called mindfulness-based attention training, as you can see the military look, MBAT, you know, it's intended for soldiers and for military family members. It allows us to see if it's the case that offering people mindfulness training before they begin that intensive period of pre-deployment training or even deploying, to see if we can protect against the declines that might come. All right, I think I'm going to have to wrap up now, but I wanted to just end on this note and basically share with you that where are we in the state of the field, right? Where we're at in the state of the field is this understanding that we have now identified a problem space with regard to the science that we can actually pursue. We can pursue in a systematic and rigorous way to answer more questions. And we are finding that there are benefits to physical well-being, to psychological health, to relationships, and stress protective effects to things like degradation in attention and working memory and mind wandering. But I also want to say that there's a lot more science to be done, and we're nowhere near the threshold we need to reach to produce a cultural understanding that the mind, just like the body, needs to be exercised daily for optimum wellness. And I hope that through our continued efforts, we'll be able to do so. So I'll just end by thanking all of you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's a fantastic talk. And we are going to have time for a couple or three questions, so if anybody in the room has a question.
Hi. You mentioned that public knowledge and interest in mindfulness training and mindfulness in general has become exponentially more popular in recent years. I was wondering how the pop culture understanding of mindfulness affects the perception of the work that you do.
Well, it leads me to giving talks like the one I just gave, which is that I think that the public interest is outpacing what the science can deliver. And I think that part of it means that as scientists who are actively doing this work, we have to say where we're really at. Because it's not a cure-all. Its effects aren't lasting if you just read a book on mindfulness. And that type of notion can actually be problematic for people, and probably would result in them disengaging from practicing altogether because they have an unrealistic view of what it takes to actually see benefits and change in their own life. So that's where I'm at. I'm at trying to course correct a little bit and have the hype kind of dwindle and the rigor of the science increase to get it to a better place.
Thank you. More questions?
Hi, thanks for your talk. I had a question about the emotional side. So has there been research published on the effect of the emotions while either being mindful or in the moment of stress? Like, how has that been handled, whether it's a flight or fight or fear, anger, anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that is a very important, and it may seem unrelated to attention, but it's actually deeply intertwined with the attentional work that I was sharing, because it ends up that these aspects of our emotional response to an experience, right, tend to be the thing that can hijack our attention away from the moment. So if you're having a fear response or you're having anger, that content consumes the attentional resources available in the moment. So part of what we're seeing actually in some of our work is that when we increase the capacity of working memory and attention, we can actually improve emotion regulation. So for example, in pre-deployment Marines, what we found is that if we do nothing at all, their negative mood, as you can imagine, their negative mood increased in the 8-week period as they approached pre-deployment, right? Got more negative, and stress the same way, anxiety the same way, everything gets more profound. But when we offered mindfulness training, those that actually practiced did not get that increase, but only if they actually showed improvements in their working memory. So what we think is happening is that ability to hold and grow this mental white space, this internal capacity to control the contents of your present moment experience, can give you a better ability to handle and deal with those negative emotions. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Just a quick question. So you mentioned there's different trainings and different studies. from practical perspective, what is the threshold you're looking right now when I guess
Great
meditation
question,
like
yes.
actually seems to matter?
Yeah,
Or like
so-
what's the
and that-
minimum number?
Thank you. So the question was regarding threshold, right? So it's like kind of one of those cut to the chase things. Do I have to go on a 3-month intensive silent retreat to have any benefit? Or can I do 5 minutes a day? Is that kind of what you mean? Like, where are we at? So that's actually what I've been spending the last 5 or so years in my lab doing across 4 DoD grants. And the question, because they want to know the same thing. You know, it's like, how much is enough, but not more than we need to actually produce benefits? Now enough, what we need, I mean, all those are fluid, right? I mean, nobody's promising that you're going to have a fully enlightened, never dysregulated person going through these programs. You're going to have people that have better attention and better mood, for example. And what we've done is we started out with using this 8-week model of MBSR, right? Which is around 8 weeks and 40 hours or more. And what we did in our studies with active duty military is we said we're going to still hold this 8-week period of time, but we're going to actually cut the time to 24 hours in one program. So that would be 3 hours a week. In another group, we'd do 2 hours a week, so 16. In another group, we did 1 hour a week, 8 hours. And what we looked to see is what the differences were in their mood and their attention and their working memory, et cetera. And what we found is that we could go as low as 8 hours and still see benefits, but only if those 8 hours actually included an emphasis on practice. So we had a comparison 8-hour program where the same trainer talked about mindfulness, but only really talked about mindfulness, wasn't spending as much time in class practicing mindfulness. That was the equivalent of doing nothing at all. So as you shorten the duration of the training, the proportion of time spent actually practicing in class is key. So now through my work with Scott Rogers, we've gone on to see if 4 weeks or 2 weeks with 8 hours is beneficial. And what we're finding is that we can now see in 4 weeks and 8 hours the benefit, but that's more than half the class being practice. So that's the nature of how it's looking.
Okay, so our time is up, and I just want to say thank you so much for doing this work, and thank you for coming here to share it with us.
It's my
Big
great pleasure.
appreciation.
Thank you.